December 24th, Christmas Eve. 7:47 p.m. I pressed the doorbell, holding a pumpkin pie tin in one hand and a folder of documents worth $31,200,000 in the other. That number looked unreal even to me, though every page carried my signature, every line was born of my work, my savings, my choices. I had imagined giving it as a final gesture, a way of saying, "You will never have to fear the future. I have built it for you." Through the door, warmth spilled out in muffled sound, music, glasses raised, children laughing. I thought perhaps they would be glad to see me. Instead, I heard my son's voice. "If she rings again, tell the kids their grandma doesn't exist anymore. She only gets in the way." The words struck with a weight heavier than the folder in my hand. The door slammed. The lights snapped off. The house went silent for a heartbeat, and then laughter roared up again, brighter, louder, as though I had never existed. I stood on the step, in the cold, with a pie and a lifetime of sacrifice turned suddenly into nothing. It was Christmas Eve. My name erased. How could they do this to me? If you want to know how I reached this moment, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and stay with me. Because now I'll tell you my story. My name is Alice Walker, and I learned early how to turn noise into order. In the 1970s I worked at NASA, writing logic for systems that kept small, stubborn machines alive in a vacuum. We called them birds, though none had feathers. The code had to be calm when everything around it was not. So was I. Then I became a mother. I stepped away from consoles and clean rooms, not because I lacked the will to stay, but because the hum in my chest shifted its frequency. I chose a smaller orbit, nursery lamps, midnight feedings, the cadence of a soft lullaby instead of the countdown to ignition. My salary vanished, my skill did not. I carried it into our home the way a mechanic carries a tool roll, quietly, efficiently, waiting for the moment it's needed. My husband, Lloyd, was charming and unreliable in the same breath. Debts arrived like bad weather. I paid them because storms, left alone, grow teeth. I taught classes at the community college, took on contract work under another name, and sold a patent for far less than it was worth. The checks went to the mortgage, the car, the dentist, the school trip I didn't want Daniel to miss. I told myself, this is what mothers do, we stabilize the orbit. Daniel was bright from the start, curious, competitive, gifted with the confidence of someone who always found a hand at his back. He liked taking things apart and leaving me to put them together. He grew tall, handsome, fast with numbers and jokes. When the guidance counselor called him a natural, I laughed and swallowed the part of me that wondered whether natural also meant nurtured by a woman you never quite saw. When Lloyd left, he did it tidily, a note, an apology, a forwarding address that never forwarded anything. I signed the papers without drama. I recalculated. I moved our savings where interest could work harder than I was allowed to. I learned to patch a roof and change a timing belt. In the evenings, I wrote small algorithms to sell to small companies. I kept receipts in a shoebox and hope in a drawer. Daniel finished high school and left for college in Boston. I covered the tuition gap each semester, never the full bill, but always the last crucial piece. His thank yous began as calls, then texts, then a thumbs-up emoji that looked like a sticker slapped over a debt. I tried not to read meaning into a symbol designed to flatten feeling. When he launched his first startup, he borrowed my name on the paperwork, just as a guarantor. Mom, the bank likes stability. I signed because I believed in him and because my signature had already built so much of his bridge. He told people he came from nothing, a word that erased my midnight contracts and careful math. I let it pass. Mothers quiet storms, we do not chase every cloud. Karen arrived like a new protocol, efficient, polished, good at making everyone feel as though the room existed because she allowed it. She organized his calendar, his friends, his life. She told me once, with a smile that didn't touch her eyes, "You've done so much, Alice. Now let us take it from here." I heard the subroutine inside the sentence, stand by, remain idle, do not interrupt the process. To them, I became function rather than person. I was the wallet that opened at the right prompt, the babysitter who arrived precisely on time, the chef whose meals appeared and vanished without ceremony. They praised my reliability and ignored my presence. On holidays I handled the dishes, on weekdays I drove the children to lessons, on weekends I replaced batteries and smoke detectors no one else remembered existed. And yet, I was not unhappy, just erased in soft pencil. The grandchildren loved my stories about the birds. I kept my hands busy, quilts, small programs, careful notes on ideas I never stopped having. I stayed near because distance widens on its own, because silence, once learned, expands until it sounds like consent. I told myself that usefulness was a kind of love, and being needed was enough. Years passed. Daniel's companies multiplied, his language changed. He spoke in valuations, in quarters, in exit strategies. He cultivated an appetite for praise that no room could satisfy. When an interviewer asked him about mentors, he said, "I'm self-taught." I watched the clip at my kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator steady as a metronome. The tea in my mug went cold. Who I am is simple, I solve problems, and I keep promises. Who they are is simple, too, a man who learned to mistake support for air, and a woman who keeps the weather fair for him. I do not judge them, I study them, the way I once studied telemetry, patient and precise. Because families, like spacecraft, don't fail from a single error. They drift, degree by degree, until home is a fraction you can't see without instruments. This is the family I loved, and the system I kept running. This is the truth before the doorbell. I did not see Cliff yet, only a hairline crack underfoot. The first visible crack appeared on Daniel's wedding day. I had prepared for it the way I once prepared spacecraft systems for launch, carefully, quietly, checking every detail twice. I baked his favorite lemon cake for the rehearsal dinner, pressed my best dress, and even stitched the lining of his suit when he discovered it had torn. My hands were steady as they had been years earlier in Houston, tracing circuits. Only this time I was mending cloth, not wires. The ceremony was beautiful in the way that ceremonies often are. Perfect lighting, music chosen for effect, guests arranged in symmetrical rows. Karen walked down the aisle with poise that seemed rehearsed, and Daniel's face lit up as though she had brought him sunlight itself. I remember thinking, this is good. He has chosen someone who makes him shine. At the reception, the toasts began. One by one, his friends stood and painted him as a genius, a leader, a man destined for greatness. His boss told stories of his brilliance in late-night meetings. Even a neighbor recalled how Daniel had once fixed his lawnmower in exchange for a cold beer. Laughter rose, applause followed, glasses clinked. Then my son stood with the microphone. His voice was warm, confident, carrying across the hall like music. He thanked his professors, his business partner, his in-laws for welcoming him into a family of strength. He even mentioned the caterer. But not me. Not one word for the mother who had paid his tuition, who had stayed awake through the storms, who had been both ballast and engine. I stood at my table, smiling at first, certain he would circle back, certain he would add, and of course, my mother, who made all this possible. But the words never came. The microphone clicked off, and the music swelled again. It was a small omission to everyone else. To me, it was silence louder than thunder. A crack, thin and almost invisible, but unmistakable to someone trained to read small failures. Systems don't fail in explosions at first, they fail in quiet, unremarkable ways. After the wedding, I tried to explain it to myself. Perhaps he forgot. Perhaps nerves carried him away. I folded the moment into memory like a file put back in the wrong drawer. But the drawer would not stay shut. In the years that followed, the pattern sharpened. When his first company succeeded, the newspapers quoted him as self-made. I read the article at my kitchen table, tea cooling beside me, the refrigerator humming like an indifferent witness. My name was nowhere in print. When birthdays came, I found myself at the far end of the table, near the kitchen door, as though I were a guest at my own son's celebration. Plates of cake passed by me last. Children leaned toward Karen's parents, not toward me. The photographer caught me in corners, holding a dishcloth, adjusting a tie, rarely seated among the honored. One afternoon, when I offered to help with the children, Karen said softly, almost kindly, "They're not used to your old-fashioned ways." She smiled, as though it were praise, and then turned away. Old-fashioned. The word lodged inside me like a splinter. I began to notice smaller humiliations. The way Daniel's phone calls grew shorter, clipped with, "Mom, I'm busy." The way invitations arrived late, sometimes after plans had already been made. The way my advice, once sought eagerly, now landed like static no one bothered to tune. Still, I remained steady. I babysat when asked, I wrote checks when their bills overflowed, I patched torn jackets and repaired broken toys. I reminded myself, storms pass, families settle, children return. But the crack widened. Each gesture I made was absorbed without acknowledgement, like rain into sand. Gratitude disappeared, replaced by expectation. I felt myself becoming not a person but a function, a service, dependable, invisible, silent. And yet, in the quiet, I began to keep my own notes. I recorded dates when promises slipped. I wrote down phrases that stung, though I told no one. I collected evidence the way I once collected data, not for revenge but for clarity. Because when systems drift, you must know the point of deviation. The wedding toast was that point. That was the moment I realized my place in their story was not mother, not even benefactor, but background. A scaffolding they no longer wished to see, though it held the weight all the same. The first crack did not break me. It simply taught me to listen differently. After the wedding, I tried to let the omission pass. One forgotten thank you, I told myself, does not erase a lifetime. But systems drift, and families are no different. A crack unobserved will only widen. The years turned, and so did the distance. At first, it was Daniel's voice on the phone. Where once he lingered to ask about my health or my garden, now his sentences grew short. "Mom, I'm busy." Always those 3 words, as though busyness were a badge of honor. I would hang up with the hum of the dial tone in my ear and the steady tick of the kitchen clock marking time he no longer had for me. Birthdays began to change, too. At Daniel's table, I was placed near the end, by the swinging kitchen door. I could smell the food before it reached the plates, hear the clatter of dishes being rinsed, but I was not part of the laughter at the center. Photographs caught me smiling politely, half turned away, while the spotlight rested elsewhere. I told myself I was imagining it, but the camera does not lie. Once, when I offered to watch the children so Daniel and Karen could attend a gala, Karen hesitated. She smiled, a tight smile, and said, "They're not used to your old-fashioned ways." Her tone was polite, but the words carried the chill of dismissal. Old-fashioned. As though safety, stories, and discipline were relics, not gifts. I began to notice the small ways I was set aside. When I brought soup after they had colds, it was received with a distracted thanks, before being pushed to the back of the fridge. When I mailed Daniel articles I thought might interest him, pieces about aerospace, about coding, he never replied. Later, I found the envelopes unopened on his desk. Money, though, was never refused. Tuition gaps, mortgage payments, even a sudden loan when one of his companies faltered. Each time, I transferred funds with a quiet sense of duty. Each time, gratitude grew thinner, until it vanished altogether. It became expectation. I was not a mother but a reservoir. At gatherings, Karen's parents were celebrated, toasted, called a blessing. I was asked to slice the pie, to keep the children occupied, to fetch an extra chair. "You're so reliable, Alice," someone once said. I smiled, though what I heard was, invisible, replaceable, unnoticed. Even the children, once eager for my stories, began to echo their parents. "Mom says you're strict. Dad says you're old-fashioned." They repeated it innocently, as children do, unaware of the sting. I adjusted my stories, softened my edges, tried to fit into the mold they had drawn for me. But no matter how carefully I shaped myself, the mold kept shrinking. The pattern was clear, my presence was tolerated, not welcomed. Every year, my chair moved further from the center. Every conversation cut shorter. Every gesture of care met with indifference. Small humiliations piled like snow, light at first, but heavy when it gathered. And yet, I did not protest. I carried the weight quietly, because mothers do. I thought of the spacecraft I had once helped monitor. When systems failed, they did not shout. They whispered in small fluctuations, tiny deviations. That was my life now, a series of whispers warning me something essential was failing. I began keeping my own record. Not out of spite, but clarity. Dates when calls ended abruptly. Notes on who sat where at dinners. The exact words Karen used, old-fashioned, reliable, said in her ways. Evidence, not accusations. I knew one day I might need to see the truth in writing, as engineers do when memory blurs. I hoped, even then, that things might turn. That one day Daniel would look up, notice the scaffolding that held him, and say the words he had once said so easily, "Thanks, Mom." But hope, like orbit, decays if not tended. The tension was no longer a crack. It was a steady drift, pulling me from the center toward the edge. And edges are dangerous places. Christmas Eve, 7:47 p.m. The night that turned every quiet doubt into certainty. For weeks, I had prepared for that evening. I baked the pumpkin pie Daniel loved as a child, the one with cinnamon folded into the crust. I ironed my best coat, polished my shoes, and placed into my suitcase the folder that carried my signature on every page. Inside it lay documents worth $31,200,000, an inheritance, an assurance, a promise I intended to deliver into my son's hands. The number still startled me. Years of contracts, investments, and the sale of patents I had written in the quiet hours had grown into that sum. I had meant it as a final safeguard. With this, I thought, Daniel would never worry about tuition for his children, about mortgages, about risks taken in business. I imagined the relief on his face when he realized the future was already secured. Snow crunched under my shoes as I walked to his door. Through the glass I saw lights glowing, shadows of guests moving inside. Music drifted out, cheerful, careless, threaded with laughter. I pressed the doorbell and waited, balancing the pie in one hand, the suitcase handle in the other. At first, there was movement. Then silence. Then, his voice. "If she rings again, tell the kids their grandma doesn't exist anymore. She only gets in the way." The words froze the air around me. I did not breathe. I did not move. I only stood, pie cooling in my hands, listening. His voice, so familiar, so sharp now. "My son." The door slammed. The porch light went dark. For a moment, the house fell quiet, and I thought perhaps he would come back, open the door, say it was a mistake. But instead, music swelled louder, glasses clinked, and a woman laughed. My existence had been erased in less than a sentence. I looked down at the pie. The crust had cracked slightly in the cold, a thin fracture across its surface. It felt like a mirror of myself. I waited a minute longer, then two, my breath clouding in the air. No one came. The lights inside flickered merrily, each one a reminder of warmth I was not allowed to share. I turned back toward the street, the weight of the suitcase pulling at my arm. Each step away from the house echoed with the memory of his words. Not just rejection, but erasure. Not "we're busy," not "come another time," but "she doesn't exist." When I reached my car, I set the pie on the passenger seat and rested my hand on the suitcase. Inside it lay the future I had built, the future I had been ready to give away. And now I saw it differently, not as a gift, but as a chain I had forged link by link, binding myself to people who no longer saw me. I whispered into the dark, "They cut me off. Now I will cut them off." My voice was steady, colder than the air around me. That night, I did not cry. There were no tears left for omission, dismissal, or silence. What came instead was clarity, sharp, clean, undeniable. For the first time in years, I felt not erased but awake. The main betrayal was not simply the words spoken at the door. It was the years that led there, the small humiliations, the forgotten acknowledgments, the taken-for-granted sacrifices. All of them had pointed to this moment, this final declaration that I was not family, not even real. I drove home slowly, the roads glittering with ice. Street lamps lit the snow in brief intervals, like frames of a film. I thought of the countless nights I had stayed awake for Daniel, the debts I had paid, the papers I had signed in his name. I thought of the research that had seeded his patents, the hours that had gone unnoticed, the mother reduced to a shadow. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew something had ended. Not my life, but theirs, at least, the version of life that had bound us together. The system had failed completely. I carried the suitcase inside, set the pie on the counter, and closed the door against the night. The silence of my own house felt different, no longer lonely, but honest. Here, at least, no one pretended I did not exist. The betrayal was complete. And now, the decision was mine. I slept little that night. The house clicked and settled in the cold, and I sat at the kitchen table with the suitcase beside me, the clock's second hand puncturing the silence. I opened the folder and fanned the pages, signatures, account numbers, transfer instructions, the careful scaffolding of a life built in quiet. I traced my name with a fingertip. The ink looked firm, unshaken. I wished I felt as steady. In the refrigerator hummed the old, faithful motor. Its sound steadied me like a metronome used to steady a trembling violinist. I brewed tea, forgot to drink it, brewed another. The pumpkin pie waited under a sheet of foil on the counter, a gift rewritten into evidence. I thought of Daniel's sentence, "She doesn't exist," and pictured it as code, a command that deletes a row from a table. One line, and decades vanish. I pulled a legal pad closer and began to list. Not grievances, but facts, dates, amounts, documents signed for him, loans forgiven, promises made and not returned. I checked my bank app, writing down what I had transferred on March 15, June 2, October 28. I noted the tuition payments, the bridge loan for his company, the time I guaranteed a lease when cash flow ran thin. My handwriting stayed neat. Engineers are trained to be legible under pressure. By 2 a.m., the list covered 6 pages. Patterns emerged as they always do when data accumulates. I had given at every crisis point, they had grown bolder with each rescue. Gratitude decayed to expectation, then to entitlement, then to contempt. That final step, spoken through a shut door, was only logical once the variables were set. I turned to the research. In my file cabinet were folders labeled with years and small stars, papers I had drafted, algorithms I had explored, notes that later mirrored the patents Daniel claimed as wholly his. I pulled out a spiral notebook from 1996, slid a printed patent abstract beside it, and watched alignments appear, approaches, comments in the margins, the same function names dressed in new fonts. I did not feel fury, I felt recognition. He had built on a foundation I poured. That is natural. Erasure is not. At 3 a.m., I closed the folder and closed my eyes. When I opened them, the choice stood there like a calm visitor at my door. No drama. No revenge. Only boundary. The sentence formed itself as if I were writing requirements for a spacecraft: protect assets. Remove access. Document provenance. Redirect legacy. I spoke it aloud to test its strength. They cut me off. Now I will cut them off. The words did not tremble. They belonged to me. I gathered the practical tools, a list of attorneys, the safe deposit box key on a blue ribbon, the thumb drive labeled Orion, the contact card of a journalist who had once asked about women behind early code. I wrote tomorrow's tasks in order of operation: bank, attorney, notary, registrar. I set the alarm for 7 and finally slept, briefly, cleanly, like a system returning to nominal after a reset. When daylight came, I washed the pie tin and stacked it with the others. I put the ribbon from the folder in a drawer. I changed my voicemail to a neutral message and placed my phone face down. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and ink. I put on my wool scarf, the green one Daniel had chosen for me years ago, and felt its softness without letting it soften my resolve. Clarity is quiet. It does not shout or beg. It arrives like frost on glass, precise and undeniable. The night had simply shown me what already was. My job, as always, was to respond with clean procedure. The girl who learned to keep machines alive in vacuum was still here. She would keep herself alive now, in a new atmosphere, one where respect is oxygen and silence is a message returned to sender. I locked the suitcase, snapped the handle down, and carried it to the door. The morning was gray and honest. I stood for a moment, listening to the hum of my own house, and recognized it, not loneliness, but proof of existence. I existed. I always had. And I would act accordingly. Before I left, I opened the pantry calendar and drew a thin line through December. Not a strike of anger, just a boundary. In the square for the 25th I wrote, begin as custodian. It helped to rename myself. Not mother as wallet, not helper on call. Custodian of work, of story, of the years ahead. Names guide behavior, I chose one that returned agency. I slid the 6-page list into a sleeve and moved it to the front of the folder. Evidence up front, gifts in the back, that would be the order now. On top I left a note, no explanations. Only confirmations. People who erase you cannot hear explanations. They only recognize changed conditions. The door had closed, my task was to close the accounts feeding the illusion. Calmly, completely. I switched off the kitchen light and caught my reflection in the window, older, steady. Not a ghost. A witness stepping onto the record. The morning after Christmas, I dressed in layers, wool skirt, white blouse, the green scarf at my neck. The suitcase came with me. Snow had crusted over the sidewalks, each step crisp. The world was hushed, as though it too waited for instructions. At 9 sharp, I entered a building of glass and steel in downtown Chicago. My appointment was with a lawyer recommended years ago by a colleague. His name was Miller, mid-50s, tidy hair, direct eyes. We shook hands, my grip was steady. I need to revise my estate plan, I said, setting the folder on his desk. Everything, assets, accounts, intellectual property. None will pass to my son. Instead, I want it directed into a foundation. He studied me a moment. Are you certain? I am, I said. Completely. I explained what the foundation would be, scholarships for young women in engineering and applied sciences, especially those who left careers to raise families and now wanted to return. Bridges, I called it. To make sure sacrifice does not erase potential. Miller nodded, already sketching notes. We spent 3 hours combing through documents. I signed, initialed, dated. Each stroke of the pen felt like the clean severing of a knot. No bitterness, only procedure. By noon, the future had been redirected. From there, I walked 3 blocks to the bank. I froze joint accounts, canceled automatic transfers, and arranged new custodial protections. The teller asked if I wished to notify the other party. No, I said. He will discover it when the balance no longer answers him. In the afternoon, I stopped at a notary's office, stamped the foundation documents, and deposited the originals in a safe deposit box. The blue ribbon around the key felt like a medal rather than a chain. That evening, I brewed tea and dialed an old number. A journalist friend, Claire, who once interviewed me about NASA. I reminded her of a conversation we'd had, about women whose names never appeared on patents though their work pulsed beneath. I have proof, I told her. Notes, drafts, dates. My son's company is built on research seeded by my hand. If you want a story, it is here. Claire was quiet, then said, yes. Let me come tomorrow. I set aside the notebooks, the printouts, the code fragments saved on old drives. I did not feel like an informant. I felt like a custodian, restoring a ledger that had been doctored. The next morning, she arrived with a recorder and careful questions. We sat at my kitchen table, documents spread between mugs of coffee. She listened more than she spoke. I showed her the overlap, my handwritten equations mirrored in patents years later, my marginalia carried into official claims. She asked if I feared retribution. No, I said. Fear is what kept me silent. Truth is quieter, but it endures. She photographed pages, scanned drives, thanked me. Before leaving, she touched my hand. Alice, this will change things. I know, I said. That is the point. In the days that followed, I continued the quiet work of separation. I changed passwords, redirected mail, transferred utilities from my name. Each task was a stitch unpicked from a fabric I had sewn too tightly around them. I packed boxes of items still in my house that belonged to Daniel's family, leftover toys, sweaters, photographs, and stacked them near the door. Not to deliver, but to remove. Presence matters, I wanted no residue of their entitlement here. Evenings, I wrote in a new notebook labeled simply, Next. In it, I drafted ideas for the foundation, lists of potential board members, names of universities with programs for women in STEM. I felt energy return as if circuits long dormant now carried current again. One entry read, First grant, $10,000, Women Re-Entering Workforce. Another, lecture series, Mothers in Science. Small beginnings, but beginnings nonetheless. When mail arrived from Daniel, holiday cards, late invitations, I set them aside unopened. Not anger, only boundary. A system no longer compatible with mine. The decisive action was not loud. There were no slammed doors, no shouted confrontations. Only signatures, transfers, sealed envelopes, passwords reset. A process as meticulous as any I had ever designed, with the same goal, survival, clarity, truth. At night, I slept more soundly. The house felt different, not emptier, but lighter, as though its walls no longer bore the weight of unspoken debts. I placed the foundation documents on the shelf above my desk and lit a small candle nearby. A private ritual, a reminder, the future now belonged to voices that would not erase me. The cutting off was complete. And in its precision, I rediscovered my own outline. 2 weeks after Claire sat at my kitchen table, the story appeared. The headline stretched across the business section, The Mother Behind the Code. Beneath it, my photograph, one I had not known she would use, me in my backyard, hair silver, holding a notebook. The article traced the history of the patents, the overlap with my earlier work, the foundation of quiet labor beneath my son's fortune. Claire's words were careful, evidence laid brick by brick. My handwriting, my dates, my drafts. Proof. The reaction was immediate. Investors began to call. Some asked for clarification, others demanded assurances. Daniel's company, once praised for innovation, now faced scrutiny. Stock fell, not in a crash but a slide so steady it frightened more than a collapse. 70% in 6 weeks. A headline in another paper read, Genius or Borrower? For the first time, his brilliance was questioned. And once doubt is planted, it grows. I watched from a distance, not gloating. Systems under stress reveal themselves. He had built his reputation on foundations he pretended did not exist. When those foundations spoke, the edifice wobbled. Simple physics. Karen did not call me, but whispers reached me. She had filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable priorities. Friends of friends passed fragments, she wanted stability, she had not signed up for scandal. I thought of her smile years earlier when she told me the children weren't used to my ways. I imagined her now, explaining to them why their father's name appeared beside words like misrepresentation and collapse. Consequences, plain and procedural. Daniel called once. His number flashed on my phone. I let it ring, then played the message later. His voice was thinner than I remembered. Mom, forgive me. I didn't mean it. I was under pressure. I need you. Give me another chance. The words landed without weight. Once, they would have broken me open. Now, they sounded like static from a distant satellite, unintelligible, irrelevant. I did not return the call. More messages followed. Some begged, some argued, some reminded me of moments from childhood, as if memory could serve as currency. I saved them, not out of sentiment, but record. Data belongs in archives. In public, he tried to defend himself. Press conferences, carefully written statements, appeals to loyalty. But each time, someone produced another document, another note of mine, another line of code whose origin was clear. He looked smaller on screen, shoulders hunched, eyes darting. The charisma that once carried rooms could not carry truth. The children, too, changed. Where once they repeated their parents' words, now they asked questions. My granddaughter sent me a drawing in the mail, 3 stick figures on a bridge, one labeled "Grandma Makes Girls Dream." I pinned it to my refrigerator. The hum beneath it sounded warmer. Karen's parents kept their distance. They had been generous hosts when my wallet was open, now, silence. I did not resent them. Systems detach when current ceases. Natural law. Neighbors approached me differently. Some congratulated, others whispered. I accepted neither congratulations nor pity. It is simply fact, I said, and left it there. Truth does not require applause. Daniel's company shed employees. Lawsuits sprouted. I read each headline with the same calm I once read telemetry, numbers changing, trajectories adjusting. None of it surprised me. When a design ignores the source of its strength, collapse is eventual. He tried once more in person. Came to my door, suit wrinkled, face unshaven. I watched from behind the curtain as he pressed the bell. The sound echoed, a cruel mirror of Christmas Eve. I did not open. He waited, shifting from foot to foot, then left an envelope on the step. Inside, a letter, apologies, promises, please. I placed it in a file labeled noise. Engineers know to separate signal from noise. Consequences unfolded without my hand. I had set only the boundary. The rest was gravity, the natural return of cause to effect. I did not hate him. Hatred consumes fuel I prefer to spend elsewhere. I simply no longer carried him. He bore his own weight now, and it was heavier than he imagined. From my window, I sometimes saw parents teaching children to skate on the frozen lake. They fell, rose, fell again. Consequences there, too, but gentle ones. The difference between falling on ice and falling from arrogance is preparation. He had prepared only for applause. The silence unseated him. The world adjusted. Investors shifted. Karen rebuilt elsewhere. The children sought answers. And I, for once, was not a footnote. My name, written clearly, could not be erased by omission. That was consequence enough. When the noise settled, I found myself in a new season. The phone stopped ringing with pleas, the newspapers moved on to fresher scandals, and the silence became mine to shape. For the first time in decades, my days belonged entirely to me. I rented a small house by the lake in Milwaukee. Its rooms were plain, but sunlight reached the kitchen each morning and the water reflected the sky in shifting blues. I furnished it with only what I needed, a table, a chair, a bed, and shelves for books. The rest I left behind. Minimal walls, minimal weight. Here, I began teaching again. Not at NASA, not even at the university, but at a small community center where women gathered to rebuild skills they once believed lost. Many had stepped away from careers for family, for illness, for circumstance. I knew their silence. I knew the ache of being seen as too late. So I taught them mathematics, algorithms, the logic of systems. Their eyes lit the way Daniel's once had, but without arrogance. They studied with hunger, and in them I saw the bridges I had dreamed of building. One afternoon, a young woman approached me after class. She had 2 children, a resume with gaps, and the conviction she no longer belonged in her field. "Do you think I can still try?" she asked. I placed my hand over hers on the desk. "You are already trying. That is enough." Her eyes filled, and I felt something unclench in my chest. This was the inheritance I wished to leave, not 30 million locked in resentment, but a current flowing forward, carrying others. Letters arrived from my granddaughter, drawings colored in bright markers. One read, "Grandma makes girls dream." I pinned it to my refrigerator, where the hum now sounded like applause. She was still young enough to see me clearly. Perhaps one day she would stand on her own bridge, steady because mine had existed. I walked each evening along the lake, the cold air biting, the water frozen in white slabs. The horizon felt endless, and I understood, freedom is not loud. It is the absence of permission seeking, the space to move without waiting for approval. For years, I had asked silently to be acknowledged. Now, I simply was. Daniel's world continued unraveling at its own pace. I no longer checked the news daily, though headlines drifted toward me. None altered my course. The divorce finalized, the company shrank, the lawsuits multiplied. He called again, less often, his messages shorter, resigned. I kept them as one keeps weather reports, useful for noting storms, irrelevant to the course of one's own walk. In my house, I kept a single ritual. Each week, I lit a candle beside the foundation documents. Not for ceremony, but reminder. That my work, my story, my choices, had not vanished. That silence could be broken by record. That erasure, though attempted, had failed. Neighbors came to know me not as Daniel's mother but as Alice, the woman who taught math by the lake. Some asked me to join knitting circles, book clubs, volunteer boards. I chose carefully, saying yes when it aligned with the life I was shaping. Boundaries, once a discovery, had become practice. I no longer felt invisible. I felt defined. By my own words, my own limits, my own quiet resolve. The betrayal had been brutal, yes, but it had also been clarifying. A system once unstable had collapsed, I was no longer tasked with holding it up. In the end, I was not erased. I had been rewritten. They shut the door in my face, but in doing so, they opened another, the one that led back to myself. I no longer wait for an invitation to belong. I no longer measure my worth by how close I sit to their table or whether my name appears in their stories. I measure it by the bridges I build, by the women I help return to their calling, by the granddaughter who draws me standing tall with stars above my head. I do not need their apologies. I do not crave reconciliation. My life no longer depends on their recognition. What matters is that I lived, I created, and I carried my strength forward, leaving a mark that cannot be erased by omission. Sometimes the best revenge is not loud or cruel, it is simply choosing yourself, with dignity and without fear. If this touched a nerve, you belong here. Subscribe, and stay close to hear more truths, where silence is no longer a burden, but strength.